Hello and welcome back. This is the week 11 lecture. So today I would like to finish chapter 4 and we're going to cover the final critical approach or style of literary criticism that we're going to cover in this class. So as we know, we've broken chapter 4 down into 3 parts. So we've already talked about the text-oriented critical approaches. We started with those a couple of weeks ago. So those are things like formalism, we talked about structuralism a little bit, and post-structuralism. But those are all schools of criticism that are primarily focused on the text, the literary text itself, regarding it as a work of art worth further study, worth close analysis. So we're primarily looking at elements of language. We're looking at a lot of those literary elements that we've talked about in this class. So we covered all of that stuff. And then last week we talked about author-oriented and reader-oriented critical approaches. Those were a little bit easier to understand, I think, a little bit less complex than the text-based stuff. So we talked about the biographical approach to literary criticism, basically just connecting an author's biography to the actual literature that author writes. Pretty straightforward, but we also talked about reader-based approaches, and those were a little bit more interesting, perhaps. At least I think so. We talked about reader response and this idea that readers really assemble and create meaning through the process of reading and analyzing text. So we talked about that as being kind of a more recent innovation. And it's increasingly, over the last several decades, it's become a very popular way to teach literature, and many of us sort of look at literature that way. Like, hey, every reader can have their own interpretation based on their own life experiences, their own ideas, their own reading style. But of course, we have to restrict those readings in some kind of a way. So we talked about the ideal reader, the reader that the author kind of keeps in mind when he or she writes, and typically we're going to fall within those categories of the types of readers that can interpret these literary texts. So we've covered all of that stuff. Today we're going to talk about context-oriented critical approaches. So this covers a lot of different schools, a lot of different types of literary criticism and theory. So we really can't do all of these different schools justice. We're just going to do a general overview today. We're going to cover some basics about some of the most important context-oriented approaches, but really we're not getting into a ton of detail about a lot of these, but we're going to run through 5 sort of types. We're going to talk about Marxist criticism, we're going to talk about new historicism, cultural studies, post-colonial studies, and then we'll conclude with feminism and gender studies. We'll also talk a little bit about movies as well, about some film theory and some popular trends in film criticism that are kind of based on some of these schools, particularly feminism. So we'll get into all of those at least a little bit here today, but just to think about context-oriented approaches more generally, clearly we are now thinking about contexts. So if you remember when we were talking about the formalists and all of those text-based approaches, we were discussing how for those critics, you know, the outside context, the historical context, any kind of cultural or social context, or any context provided by, you know, the biography or the facts of the author's life, none of that stuff really mattered for a lot of those text-based critics because they wanted to stay inside the text. They wanted to just deal with the language of the text. Well, now we're looking at several schools that are interested in context. They are interested in larger historical or cultural contexts that might help to shape or influence the literary text that we are analyzing. So, like the book points out, this all kind of started with literary history, which is kind of an older, very traditional approach to literary criticism or theory, and it's been around for centuries. But when people started to put together literary history, that's when we were able to divide literature up into different time periods and into different categories based on genre and style. So once we started doing that, we really were sort of using a context-based approach. In that case, the context obviously being history, and that is one of our big contexts that we typically consider when we use these types of approaches for the analysis of literature. So you guys know what context means, but just remember the definition. The context of something that refers to everything surrounding that thing, everything around it, the atmosphere around it, things that might have had an impact on it, things that might have influenced it, things that are going around or going on at the time that these texts are set or at the time that these texts are written and published. So we're looking at that stuff now. We were kind of ignoring a lot of that stuff earlier with our text-based approaches, and we weren't always looking at that stuff last week with our author and reader-based approaches. But now we are very focused on context. So let's just kind of race through some of the major schools that the book talks about, and I can try to add a little bit of detail and explanation for these different schools. We don't need to be experts. We don't need to know everything about these critical schools, but we need to know a little because eventually we're going to be using at least one of the approaches that we've looked at over the last several weeks. So many of us are going to want to use one of these context-based approaches. So we need to get at least a little bit comfortable with them. So in the book, we start with Marxist literary theory. So some of us might be a little bit reluctant to dive into this one because, you know, in the Western world, certainly in the US, we have a lot of negative connotations that are sort of evoked by the word Marxism. Makes us think of communism. We think it's bad. We're taught that it's bad, and it's obviously not the system that we have here. So we tend to kind of reject it out of hand, and we certainly don't have to embrace it economically or, you know, as a system to live by. But when it comes to the analysis of literature, Marxist theory actually has played a very big role in the development of literary criticism and theory in the US and also in Western Europe, primarily England, France, you know, other Western European countries, our allies. And the reasons for this are a little bit strange, and we don't need to try to understand all of them right now, but you need to understand that, you know, literary critics who use Marxist theory to help them analyze text, they don't necessarily have to be card-carrying Marxists. They don't necessarily have to subscribe to all the aspects of the ideology. They're just using it kind of as a lens to help them approach and analyze lit. So as we know, Marxism is based on the writings of Karl Marx, who was a German sort of philosopher, economist, writer, and we don't need to get too deep into the politics. We've probably learned a little bit about him, but obviously Marxist theory is very interested in social classes and economic forces. So Marx writes a lot about different social classes. He's primarily interested in the distinction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Those might be terms that we are familiar with. So the bourgeoisie, in his eyes, they were kind of the capitalist owner class. They owned their own businesses oftentimes. They may have owned factories or other types of businesses, and they were the ones employing lots of workers, acquiring money, and usually living pretty well. And then we have the proletariat on the other side. These are like the working class people, factory workers. who often didn't make very much money. We got to remember what historical time period we are here. Think about context. Marx is writing in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution has sort of kicked into overdrive in Europe and here in the US. So we have a lot of factories springing up, a lot of industrial stuff going on, a lot of manufacturing. Things are getting built and things are modernizing very fast. Technology is advancing. So really a lot of change is happening before people's eyes. And one thing that's really changing is the notion of class. As you have more and more people moving to cities, working in factories, you have the development of new social classes in many ways. And it's during this time that we see a big rise in the middle class. So really, a lot of the traits that Marx is describing here with the bourgeoisie, a lot of that applies to kind of upper middle class people, how we might think of upper middle class people today. These aren't necessarily at the very top of the hierarchy, but he's sort of just making a general distinction between the ruling classes and the working classes. And he says the ruling classes tend to own most of the property. They own the means of production, which means they own these factories. They own these places where stuff gets made. And then you have the working classes who are at the mercy of the ruling classes. The working classes are the sort of hourly employees. They might not own very much. They don't own property. They might own their own home, but likely they're renting. They don't have as much money or political influence or overall power, as the ruling class. So Marx is interested in this dynamic, and he famously and wrongly predicts that the working classes will rise up and revolt against the ruling classes. That's never really happened on a worldwide scale. But even though he was clearly wrong about stuff and we reject certain aspects of his overall ideology, like I said, literary critics started using certain parts of his theory, certain pieces of his writing to help them analyze literature, because looking at literature through the lens of social class can often be a pretty effective way to analyze. And also Marx and other, sort of followers of his theories kind of believe that literature, along with other works of art, were often used by the ruling classes to help them sort of maintain control over the working classes. So that's also kind of tied into this school of criticism, this idea that works of art have something that he called commodity value. And they become sort of valued in a marketplace of like ideas and culture. So this is not the same as setting a market price for like a table or some kind of object with a lot of practical utility, something that has a clear use. And the price is usually based on how much people want it or need it or how useful it is. But art is different. Commodities that get created in the world of art, like paintings or novels or plays, or to think more modern, in a more modern sense, movies or TV shows, all of that stuff has a certain value, not always based necessarily on how much it's worth, but based on how important it's considered to be, or how beautiful it's considered to be, or how much pleasure it brings people. So it's this weird value that gets attached to artistic commodities. And Marx would argue that a lot of that stuff gets sort of used by the ruling classes in order for them to protect their own interests. They're kind of creating art in some cases for the working classes, for the proletariat, but maybe that art is designed to just kind of pacify people or keep people content in their current station and to kind of maintain the power dynamics as they are. But not all Marxist critics are necessarily looking at that. Some might just be interested in issues of class and different classes being depicted in works of literature. They might just be interested in certain forms of economic power. Again, this dynamic between the kind of haves and the have-nots, the ruling classes and the regular people, that exists in a lot of societies. You don't necessarily need to be a Marxist or a communist to believe in those kinds of distinctions. So we can just use some of Marx's ideas to help us look at certain texts. Basically, that's largely what it comes down to. But one thing the book points out that's kind of interesting is that Marxist critics are often interested in what they refer to in the book as the conditions of production. So again, thinking about literature a little bit more economically, thinking about it as something that has value, something that gets produced, often mass produced in the modern age, like a lot of other things. It gets mass produced, it gets marketed, it gets sold. We go out there and buy works of literature in various ways. Normally now we're just buying ebooks, or we might buy subscriptions online to read stuff. But this is a marketplace, right? This is an economic arrangement. So a lot of Marxist critics are interested just sort of in the way books get made, the way they're put out there in the marketplace. So they mentioned this sort of idea in the book that Marxist critics have kind of floated about the rise of the novel. And we've sort of talked about this a little bit in here when we were talking about sort of the stages of literary history. We talked about how the novel becomes big in England during the 1700s. Not too long before Marx was writing, about 100 years before. So, as they say in the book, there were certain conditions, certain economic and social conditions that helped to create the environment that the novel needed to flourish. So you have, like I've mentioned, sort of this rise of a middle class, a much bigger middle class than what would have existed in previous centuries. So you have people now with a little bit of disposable income and leisure time. And what are you going to do in your free time? Well, back then, often the answer was read for pleasure. So you had a growing audience, but also, I think I've mentioned the printing press at some point when we've been talking about history. That revolutionized the sale of literature. The printing press had already been around for several hundred years by the 1700s, but it helps to, it allows us to mass produce literature. We can make a bunch of copies, mechanical reproduction. Obviously, we can sell more copies now. Literature becomes a lot more accessible. People can get it more easily. And this is also helping to grow the general reading public. So all of this stuff is happening in the 1700s. Also, they mentioned that there's a new sort of payment system. There's a new way to pay authors based on royalties. And again, this is based on book sales, ultimately. So there's this whole economic model that's getting created at that time in the 1700s in Western Europe, and a little bit also here in the US, but we're sort of younger, we're still colonies. But this is happening not just because creative people are writing novels, but because there are certain economic conditions in place, certain conditions of production in place created by the ruling classes, the owners, the people who own things, and that helps to create novels, modern novels. And they contrast that period to the earlier Elizabethan era, like when Shakespeare was writing. And they said back then, a lot of that stuff didn't exist. I mean, first of all, the printing press was still pretty new. You didn't have such a big reading middle class. Remember, Shakespeare, a lot of his audience could have been illiterate because they were coming to watch these performances. They weren't reading his plays necessarily at home like we do. That wasn't so common. So you didn't have such a big reading middle class. You didn't have the same kind of technology, or at least it had not been maybe perfected. It had not been around as long, and they didn't have that method of paying authors. They didn't have a royalty system that would allow authors to make more money off their books. So Like they mentioned in our book, back in Shakespeare's day, there was a patronage system where wealthy individuals would pay writers to create a poem or a play. And that was kind of how the writers were supported and how they could make money off their work. So it was kind of based on the generosity and the artistic interest of wealthy individuals. Kind of an unreliable system. So it was harder to be a professional writer back then. There was less of a literary marketplace. Therefore, we had different kinds of writing. There was more of an emphasis on drama and poetry, some of these older forms of literature, because they weren't, because we hadn't modernized in certain ways. A couple hundred years later, the novel, a more modern type of literature, grows in large part because of these economic conditions, the way things get made. So that's all economic. And that also kind of ties back into social class. There was a certain type of person that was starting to consume novels. A lot of middle class people, not the top of the top, but relatively affluent. They had some money and they had some leisure time. So their class status gave them an opportunity to read for pleasure. And later, again, there's future developments. Later, they would start marketing novels, certain kinds of novels, to working class readers and people who, wanted, adventure stories. And that was kind of the rise of dime novels and, a lot of sort of pulpy adventure and action and mystery stuff. A lot of that was geared towards certain classes of readers. So you can see how somebody operating within this school could do a lot of work, not just looking for class stuff in literature, but also thinking about how that class stuff, how economic factors have an influence on the actual production of literature. What kinds of literature get written, and also how does that stuff get published? How does it get sort of sent out there into the world? So there's a lot you can do with it. And again, you don't have to necessarily buy in to the whole ideology in order to use the approach. So that's the Marxist school. We'll kind of move on. The next one they talk about is New Historicism. So I wanted to spend some time on this because we've already talked about the historical approach a little bit last week when I was explaining the biographical approach to literature. And I mentioned that these are really sort of these are really old-fashioned critical schools that have been around for a very long time. And they were sort of the traditional ways that we would write about literature. We would look at literature through the lens of biography, the author's biography, or we would think about what the work of literature had to say about the historical time period in which it was set. Or something like that. Or we might read it through a theological lens, thinking about religion, or, we could use some other disciplines, even linguistics. But those are some of the older traditional styles of criticism that have really been around for almost as long as literature has been around. But when we talk about new historicism, the name says it all. We are updating the old historical approach. So we are once again looking at historical context, just like we would have done potentially hundreds of years ago. But now we're doing it in a slightly more modern way. And like the book says, the major change with New Historicism is now, as critics, we can look at a literary text and what it has to say about a historical event or a historical time period. But then we can also look at the history as another text to analyze. This school kind of argues that history and literature really aren't all that different. And if you think about it, the claim makes a lot of sense. There are some differences, of course, chief among them being that history is supposed to be real and true, whereas literature is often completely made up. That's kind of what fiction means. But we know the way that history gets told. right? History is almost always put in narrative form because that's how humans learn best. That's how we remember best. So we typically have characters. We have some kind of a plot. Things are happening. We have a unique setting. We have big plot events. We have conflict. We have all the things, a lot of the key elements that we would look for in a novel or a play or an epic poem, any other kind of fiction. So a lot of critics now will say, look, we can read history like literature, and we can read literature like history. We don't have to have really, strong boundaries between the two. So they have this idea that texts, literary texts, are historical. Just always, to some extent or another. So unlike formalists, who we remember really don't care about history, they don't care about historical context, a new historicist would say, you really can't understand the meaning of a text unless you understand all of the various contexts. So they're kind of diametrically opposed to some of those text-based critics who would say, look, all we need is the language. We can figure out the one true meaning just by looking at metaphors and meter and imagery. Whereas a new historicist would say, look, because all literature is historical to some extent, it either reflects certain history or it was created as a result of certain historical events. Because of that, you can't escape the historical context. And any reading that ignores historical context is going to be incomplete, and you're not going to be able to really grasp the full meaning of the text. So, think about that, determine if you agree with that. But they also argue that history is textual, by which they mean the way we understand history. The way that history gets told and recorded is very much like fiction, as I was just saying, so we can read it that way. And we can do that even though we might acknowledge that, yes, okay, I'm reading a history book and I'm acknowledging that certain things in this book are facts and they are verifiable. I can look them up, I can double check, cross-reference them, and I can confirm that they are in fact real things that have actually happened. But they say even if that's the case, that's fine. That doesn't change the fact that the history is still structured largely like literature. It has certain symbolic functions. It has imagery. It might have figurative language. Like I said, it has all of these elements that we would normally find in a work of literature. So we can read it that way. We can use the strategies and the techniques that we would normally use with literature. We can use that stuff to also analyze history. So this is kind of liberating in some ways, but they're not totally different in every way from those text-based critics that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So like structuralists, or certainly like post-structuralists, they're interested in different kinds of texts. So again, for a new historicist, we can look at something that might not have previously been considered a work of literature, like a ship's log, or some kind of inventory, or some kind of record of objects, or like tangible items that we find in, some old house, or, some artifact, or some kind of, surviving text. It doesn't have to be literature. We can read it however we want. So they're interested in different forms of discourse. You remember we talked about this earlier in the semester. They're interested in various types of texts and discourses, not just poems, novels, short stories, but almost any kind of documentation that we can read and interpret. That becomes a text that can be analyzed just like a work of literature. And remember the idea of discourse. These are sort of narratives or ideas, but they're not always necessarily written down. These are things that people know, people talk about. They might appear in textual form, but these are often major stories that have a lot of cultural importance or historical importance, kind of stories that people tell themselves, the stories we tell of ourselves as a nation or as a people. Those are popular sort of cultural discourses. They're just in circulation. Sometimes they're written down, sometimes they're known more through word of mouth. So all of that stuff is fair game for a new historicist because they're looking at history, literature, all kinds of texts as being, potentially rich with meaning, and they can analyze all of that stuff. So again, we're not just treating history like background material. That's kind of what the old historical approach did, just focusing on it as background, as backdrop, something that has a role but might be secondary. For new historicists, there's no real separating the literature from the history. You can't separate the literary text from the period in which it was written or from its historical setting or both. So for them, it's all kind of wrapped up together, and we can use the same techniques to analyze literature and history. So this is still very popular. This actually grew up kind of in the, 70s, 80s, kind of developed a little bit later in the 20th century, and it's still a very popular approach today. So they also mentioned cultural studies in the chapter. So this is pretty easy to understand, I think. We're just focused on many different forms of culture. So we're talking primarily about artistic self-expression here and all the different sort of manifestations of that. So we've been doing sort of cultural studies work really throughout the semester with our alternative media assignments, because that's kind of what we're doing. We're stepping outside of literature and we're thinking about other forms of cultural expression. So we can think about the visual arts, we can obviously think about film or TV, we can think about music, architecture, fashion, or really any other aspect of like popular culture. We could think about social media, gossip magazines, almost anything could fall under this category, as long as it's a cultural product. It's something that expresses some aspect of a particular culture. So a lot of it would be considered art, but not just art. It could also be other forms of expression, people commenting on art. But again, music, buildings, all of that stuff can be viewed as cultural expression. Certain ideas, certain values, certain aesthetic principles that we kind of share as a culture, they're all going to be on display in these various types of texts, these various types of expression, so we can analyze any of it. And we've been doing that. We've analyzed music, we've analyzed TV shows, we've analyzed movies, certainly. So cultural studies just kind of opens things up. And again, we're using the techniques and strategies that were traditionally used to analyze literature, but we're just kind of reading all of this other stuff much like it is literature. And again, this is very common today. A lot of this work is getting done in colleges and universities today. This is increasingly how we approach culture. We used to have really strong sort of boundaries between what was called high culture and low culture. So literature, at least sort of traditional literature, epic poetry, really beautiful lyric poetry, drama, maybe some classic novels, those would have been considered high culture, high brow. Really only people with a pretty high degree of education may have been considered, sort of the target audience. They would have had access to that stuff. And then there would have been other art forms that would have been kind of considered more lowbrow or low culture. So 50 years ago, TV was sort of considered more for the masses. That was more low culture. Anybody could watch TV by, the 60s or so. And typically the quality of stuff on TV was sort of judged to be lesser than classic works of literature or visual art or the ballet or opera. Those would have all been high culture. Low culture would have been comic books, TV, B movies, westerns and, monster movies. So there used to be strong distinctions between high culture and low culture, but I think increasingly those distinctions are going away. You can go to really good, sort of cultural websites and read reviews about TV shows, graphic novels, just about anything. There's not as much of a separation anymore. And again, we can use the tools that were previously used to analyze works of high culture, and now we can look at stuff that maybe previously would have been classified as low culture, but now it's just, part of pop culture, and everything kind of exists a little bit more alongside one another. Maybe now we have more and more blending between different kinds of cultural expression. So cultural studies just kind of looks at all those different corners. And then they move on to post-colonial studies. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Another approach that's very popular right now, got very popular, sort of towards the end of the 20th century, and continues to be one of the sort of major schools, one of the major approaches that critics and scholars use today. So when we talk about post-colonial studies, this is kind of connected to cultural studies, thinking about culture, but we're also thinking about colonialism and the history of colonialism, not just in the Western world, but parts of Southeast Asia, Africa as well. So we're sort of specifically interested in a historical process here, the process of colonialism and what happened in a lot of parts of the world when colonialism ended. So as we know, we ourselves here in the U.S., we have our own colonial past. We used to be an assortment of British colonies. So we share certain aspects of our history with other parts of the Americas. Obviously, South American countries were originally Spanish colonies, with the exception of Brazil. They were originally a Portuguese colony. So this history can be found in Africa, parts of Asia, the Caribbean, definitely, and the Americas. So we're not just interested in colonial history, but we're also interested in the decline of colonialism and what happens in these places when those old European powers, the British, the Spanish, the French, what happens when they left and these places became independent. So again, that's a huge part of our history, and it's a part of many other countries' history as well. So they're looking at some of these changes that occur in a post-colonial culture. So a lot of times what happens in these places is you have writers in these places trying to sort of reclaim their culture. Maybe trying to sort of cast off the culture imposed on them by the British or by the French, whatever colonial power was there. And we certainly see this, it's a very distinct and marked process in the Caribbean and a lot of other places where you had sort of forced labor or slave labor, and you had large groups of formerly enslaved or oppressed people who became free. Who were able to eventually gain independence and kind of create their own country without so much direct influence from the old European powers. So how does that get reflected in their art? How does that get reflected in their literature? Because, of course, the cultures that exist in these places, they're kind of hybrid. There's sort of a blending of different cultures, Native American, European, African. So you kind of create new cultures. And again, that gets reflected in art. That's reflected in literature. So we've seen this process play out, over the last 200 years or so. All of the colonial holdings of those European powers have pretty much become free. sometimes through revolution, like what we had, sometimes through peaceful transfers of power. But there's always a legacy to explore, and there's always a big body of literature written about not just, like I said, the colonial past, but the sort of post-colonial present. And just one kind of interesting thing to consider is just the actual language that we speak. Think about English as a language. Think about all the different parts of the world where English is spoken. This really is a legacy of colonialism. You think about the British Empire, it used to be very big. We were a part of it, but they had colonies in the Caribbean. They had colonies in Africa. They had they controlled India for a long time. They had colonies in other parts of Asia. Australia originally belonged to them. They had some holdings out in in other parts of like the Pacific. So in all of those places, people still speak English. Obviously here, we speak English because we were British colonies. A lot of people in the Caribbean, obviously Australians, certain African nations as well. So just the fact that so many people speak English, just the fact that so many people in Latin America speak Spanish, all of that really is a direct byproduct of colonialism. Language was a colonial aspect, not just culture, but also language. That stuff spread largely through colonialism. So again, you have the creation of new cultures, new forms of expression, especially after these places become independent. So there's a whole school of criticism that really revolves around some of these issues. So the book gets into a few more details. We don't need to know a lot, but just again, keep in mind, because again, we're still thinking about history here. So keep in mind the importance of historical context and cultural context. Post-colonial studies really drive those home. And then finally, they wrap up with feminism, and then they talk a little bit about gender studies, and they're obviously related. So feminism, like Marxism, has a big influence on the development of literary criticism, particularly here in the US. So this is another term that's kind of fraught and controversial, and I know people have different opinions, different viewpoints, and that's fine. We're not talking about politics here. We're talking about feminism as it relates to the analysis of literature. So we're going to define feminism in sort of the traditional way, just thinking about it as a broad set of movements, beliefs, and ideologies that are all designed to advocate for and establish equality between the sexes. That's all I mean when I use the term here. We're using it in that sort of broad traditional way, just the basic push for equality between the sexes, and equality kind of in all respects, thinking about legal equality, economic equality, social equality, and also cultural equality, and that is the thing. So that's the definition we'll use, and obviously there are a lot of feminist readings of literary works. This is a whole school, it's a whole approach. But just like with Marxism, you don't have to necessarily consider yourself to be a feminist to use the feminist approach. You don't necessarily have to agree with all of these ideologies and belief systems that are at work. You can simply look for certain things, again, looking for certain contexts and thinking about the effects they have on works of literature and how they might shape works of literature. So one way that I like to think about it, this is not in our book, but it's in a previous book I've used, when we're thinking about feminism, particularly as it relates to culture and art, we're often focusing on sort of what is absent rather than what is present. So we're often looking maybe at mistreatment, marginalization, inequality, perhaps suffered by female characters in works of literature. But we can also think about how women writers, in some cases, are and were historically sort of marginalized or silenced largely, because of, patriarchal cultures and how they existed, especially in previous eras, generations ago. So it's not that we didn't have women writers. We've had women writers really at every stage of literary history, but they weren't always given a lot of platforms. They weren't always recognized or sort of given the same kind of critical attention. Even if they were popular and sold copies, they might not have been analyzed as much as their male counterparts. So that's something that feminist criticism looks to rectify as well. So there's a lot we could cover here. Again, I feel like we're just kind of doing the whole approach a little bit of a disservice. We're not spending enough time on it. But one thing to remember is we have a lot of different feminisms today. It really has evolved, and it's now the goal of a lot of critics is to capture the perspectives of many different kinds of women. We don't really get into this in the book, but sort of the history of feminism in the U.S. as it begins to develop, going all the way back to sort of the 19th century, early 20th century, when they're fighting for the vote and they're sort of fighting for basic political rights, but all the way up through subsequent waves and periods, it was kind of dominated historically by white, middle class, largely heteronormative women. And now we're opening it up and we're seeing different schools of feminism for different identities. And it's not necessarily as dominated by that sort of traditional group. But just to give you a really quick history, the book doesn't really do this, but just to think about it in broader terms, we usually break feminism in the U.S. down into three historical periods: the first wave, the second wave, and the third wave. And I think we're still kind of in the third wave right now. So the first wave begins in the late 19th century, really. And it's just, like I said, sort of fighting for legal rights, such as the right to vote. But a lot of first wave feminists were also abolitionists. So if we go back to the 19th century, a lot of them were fighting for other social causes. They were reformers in kind of a broader sense. But among the causes they were fighting for, obviously political equality, political rights for women. So remember, the 20th Amendment giving women the right to vote, that doesn't come about until 1920, almost literally 100 years ago. So that's kind of the big success of the first wave. And the first wave kind of concludes more or less with the right to vote. Then we have the second wave, which kind of comes along kind of around World War II, sort of the middle of the 20th century, right after the war ends. And you kind of have an important social development. You guys have probably learned about this in history class, but during the war, a lot of men are off fighting. A lot of women fill what would have been traditionally considered to be masculine jobs during wartime, working in factories, helping to build weapons and other things for the war effort. And this was thought at the time to perhaps be the first step in a larger change and a sort of a move towards a more equal society. But then when the war ends, the men come back, and a lot of the women were expected to just sort of return to their previous roles as wives and mothers, many of whom did not work, just sort of managing the household. And obviously that's fine with some people. Not everyone wanted that. So you kind of have this era of prosperity in the 50s, early 60s, the post-war years, the economy's booming. But you have this sort of these rumblings, and again, this next wave that comes about is a little bit less focused on political rights, and it's a little bit more focused on social and cultural issues, recognizing that our culture in America at that time is still very unequal, and this pertains to art. A lot of the most celebrated, famous, popular writers, movie directors, TV writers, largely male. So you have a largely male perspective in a lot of popular works of cultural expression, a lot of popular works of art. So this is kind of the beginning of the second wave. And now we kind of begin to think a little bit more about like cultural feminism, thinking about sort of celebrating women's voices, women's expression, and also what's called difference feminism kind of grows up as a part of the second wave. Not just striving for equality, sure, they're still doing that. That's an ongoing process, but also kind of recognizing the importance of certain distinctive qualities that women have versus men. So kind of celebrating femininity in certain ways that maybe had not been done previously. So the second wave kind of moves us forward a little bit more culturally, a little bit more socially. And then the third wave is often thought to have begun sort of around the 90s. And again, it's largely defined by how it challenges some of the earlier assumptions that earlier feminists had made. So again, this is largely about opening up the larger category, hearing more voices, kind of getting away from this idea that there's one sort of essential female identity that most women sort of fall under. Because again, previously, I think for reasons that we can understand, that sort of essential classic female identity was usually white, and it was usually a very certain type of woman. So with the third wave, it's largely driven by this desire to recognize more types, more voices, but they're also kind of influenced by post-structuralism a little bit during the process of all this expansion. As they're reading text, there's this idea that maybe there's not just one meaning, right? Like we were talking about with post-structuralism, this idea that texts don't always have stable meanings, language isn't always stable, so things change, meanings can change, identities can change over time. So they're kind of interested in a lot of that. So again, the book doesn't get into all of this, but I just wanted to mention just a few of those things to give us a little bit more background. And they do mention these 3 stages of development. So I did want to run through those a little bit, just as feminism is increasingly applied to works of literature and other art, but particularly with literary analysis, the book talks about these 3 sort of steps. So step 1, you had a lot of feminist critics kind of looking at the portrayal of women in literature. Because again, one trend that we were noticing right off the bat is that a lot of classic works of literature were written by men. So you have a lot of women characters written by men. So that was something to analyze, something to look into, and that's kind of where we start. But then stage 2 is kind of revisiting the canon. The canon is just a term that refers to like a collection of the best texts, the greatest texts produced by a country or in a historical period. And these are the texts that are studied and read and celebrated and analyzed. So this idea of expanding the canon becomes popular. I would argue that the second wave feminists were talking about this, but it's certainly very prevalent now in the third wave, just trying to get more women authors in the canon, sort of rediscovering texts that might have been popular in previous eras, but they've kind of fallen by the wayside, or maybe they're discovering previously unknown writers, or they're trying to reevaluate writers that we know about but maybe just haven't done very much work with lately. So just adding more women to the canon, because I think we mentioned this with literary history. I didn't get into it much, but at least with the history of literature in the U.S., some of the most successful best-selling authors in early U.S. literature were women. And that was a fact that kind of got glossed over when literary study first kind of got underway in this country, when American literary study got underway kind of in the early 20th century. So a lot of women got left out of the canon, even though they were arguably more popular and more influential than some of their male counterparts. But the men often, like, the likes of Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman, they're in the canon and a lot of their women contemporaries were not. So that second stage was largely about opening up the canon and including, and analyzing more works written by women, exploring more women's voices. And then they say the third step is really just more based on the texts themselves, based on, style and different features of language. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying with difference. There's different kinds of differences that can be explored if we're thinking about women's voices versus men's, or women characters versus male characters, male authors versus female authors. So there's a lot of different sort of models of difference that we can look at in that third stage when we're really looking just at the text themselves. We're just analyzing text from this kind of feminist perspective, or kind of using some of these ideas. So you can look at difference based on biological differences, just differences in bodies. That's one avenue that you could pursue. You can think about linguistic difference between the sexes. You can think about how women and men might use language differently. And that's a very interesting one. Do we have slightly different languages, or at least do we use language in slightly different ways? We can certainly look for that in literary analysis. We can also think about sort of psychological differences, differences in mental states or psyches. We don't always believe that all of these levels of difference exist, but they are fair game if you want to look for them or explore them in texts. And then we could also think about cultural differences. Are there different cultural contexts or cultural expectations in place for men versus women? And if so, how do those show up in works of literature? How might those affect certain characters? Or how might those affect authors in the actual composition of these works? So, again, very popular now. These approaches have been around really since maybe the 60s, 70s. This kind of work started getting done, and it's still happening now. So they kind of use feminism as a entry to kind of get into gender studies, which is another sort of more recent, more modern, critical approach that we definitely see a lot of today. And it's deeply influenced by certain strands of feminism, especially this kind of feminism that gets away from kind of what I said earlier, this idea of like the one essential set of qualities that all women have. This is an idea of essentialism. And some people believe this, and it's okay. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong, but there's increasingly been a pushback against it, this idea that there are essential qualities, basic characteristics that all women have or that all men have. And increasingly we're questioning that, maybe pushing back on that, and that kind of helps give rise to gender studies, which is largely sort of an idea that we need to analyze gender as it works in literature, as it shows up in texts, and as it might influence the creation of text. But like that rejection of essential femininity, a lot of gender studies sort of rejects the idea that gender is biological. Like this idea that there's a difference between sex and gender. Sex is biological difference, and that was one of the types of differences that we could look at. But this idea that gender is actually constructed through culture or socially. So gender is not inherent, it's not natural the way differences in sex might be. So this idea that we see with gender studies is that the ideas circulating around gender are largely socially constructed. There are certain social roles that have been created for men and for women. And oftentimes they are placed in those roles, but there's nothing inherent or natural about them. They can be reversed, they can be changed, and that's kind of the idea at work here. So again, we do see differences, but these differences don't come from nature. they come from society. They ultimately come from us. They come from our own culture. So we can sort of explore those differences. We can interrogate them. We can decide how they're working or not working in certain literary texts. So these are, very basic sort of core distinctions that we often make, in our culture, like between masculine and feminine, one or the other, right? Gay or straight. And a lot of gender studies people would say those distinctions don't always hold up. Not everybody is one or the other. Some people have an identity that's somewhere in the middle, and we can observe that with characters, again, in literature, or we can maybe think about how some of those ideas just show up in literary text or how they help to shape literary text. So increasingly, we have a lot of, critics and theorists who are just kind of rejecting a lot of the old binaries that used to be, very important in our culture, like male versus female. They're just sort of doing away with those distinctions. We know they still exist, but, they're doing other kinds of work, and they're maybe rediscovering certain, queer characters with fluid identities, and they're just kind of exploring that fluidity more. And that's happening right now. That's a popular school of criticism right now. And you can revisit old text using that approach. Some of these critics are going back to Shakespeare. They're going back to Walt Whitman, who is a famous American author who probably had a pretty fluid sexual identity, certainly in terms of sexual preference, maybe a fluid gender identity. We can read his texts through this lens. We can go back to Shakespeare and look at his texts through this lens. Look at certain characters or certain situations through that kind of a lens. So this is very much kind of what's happening right now. This is one of the newer approaches right now in literary criticism, and you can do a lot with it. So again, based on sort of their larger beliefs and this kind of idea that things change and can be fluid and things kind of develop and change over time. Meanings are not fixed. Social roles don't have to be fixed. For some of those reasons, a lot of gender theorists, they're kind of fond of post-structuralism a little bit, some of that text-based stuff. The later text-based stuff where they said, hey, language is weird, the relationship between signifier and signified is arbitrary, so all this stuff is kind of subject to change. Those ideas kind of appeal to a lot of feminist and gender studies critics because they're finding a lot of fluidity and change in the text that they analyze. And they're finding things that, meanings, certainly, perhaps based on gender, that we had not previously seen. So again, that meaning might change when we look at it through a different lens. So the final thing I wanted to mention, just because it is in the chapter, is film studies, film theory. And they mention feminist film theory in particular. So we have been talking about movies a little bit, so I just wanted to wrap up the lecture by talking about movies again, and just sort of reminding you that all of these theories, all of these critical approaches, they can all be applied to movies and the study and analysis of movies, and they often are applied to film. But the book mentions feminism as as a type of critical school that really took off in film, in the study of film. So I just wanted to go over a couple things they mention and just flesh it out a little bit. So again, they were interested, feminist film critics were interested in a lot of the same things that the literary critics were interested in, representation of women, how are they portrayed, how are female characters portrayed in film, but also spectatorship and what was called sort of the male gaze. And this is a particular concept that comes from feminist film theory, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. And again, keep in mind the historical context. A lot of this work was getting done back in the 1970s. So the idea with the male gaze, it's pretty simple. It's just the idea that usually back then movies were made by men, And the sort of ideal spectator, kind of the ideal reader that we were talking about last week, was normally a man. So, in other words, as a film goer, as somebody watching a movie, you were normally asked to identify with the protagonist, with the male protagonist, the main character. You were normally invited to see things through that character's eyes. And that makes sense. The majority of protagonists in previous decades were male. And like I said, the majority of movie directors were also male. So this idea that it's the male perspective, and sure, there's women on screen, there's women characters, there's actresses, but they're all viewed from the perspective of men. So even if you're a woman watching a movie, you're still kind of forced to identify with the male perspective. And when you see women on screen, when you see women characters, you're seeing them often as men see them, because you're kind of getting your perspective, filtered through the perspective of a male character and a male director and probably a male screenwriter. So they noticed some problems with this and they wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So they have a couple of ideas that are kind of related. They talk about reflection theory. It's kind of related to the male gaze. This is just the idea that, movies do kind of reflect social reality for women to a certain extent. We see women on screen doing things that women might actually do in the real world, but typically the theory goes that movies kind of shrink the number of potential roles or occupations for women. There's only a handful of things that women can really be in classic movies. They can be, and this is a quote from a critic from back then, they can be virgins, vamps, victims, suffering mothers, or sex objects. And that might be, a little bit smaller than the group really is. There might be a few other roles, but I think there's some truth to that. If you look at classic movies from the mid-20th century, a lot of the women are going to be wives of the main character, perhaps. They might be moms. They might be damsels in distress, like the suffering victim. They might be a sex object of some kind. Again, that viewers are being invited to look at and watch, perhaps in a sexual way. So there's this idea that there's a very limited number of available roles for women, and that was certainly true in earlier decades. So then the male gaze kind of comes back to this whole idea of basically men looking at women. And when you're watching a movie, you're occupying the perspective of a man, and any woman you see, you're seeing them as they are seen through the eyes of a man, either a male character or a male director. And what a lot of the theorists said is when women are only given a handful of roles that they can be, and then you have the male gaze placed on top of that, basically male viewers are given just a handful of options. You can either punish certain women, you can save certain women, like vulnerable, innocent women that are in danger, or you can turn the women into fetishes, and that just means an object of desire. So basically, men can either punish them, desire them, or save them. Those are basically the only options available. So, as the theory goes, with all of this in place, we have certain problems in terms of representation and the ways that women are viewed. So, just to kind of give you an example of this, I posted a clip from an old movie from the 1940s that kind of illustrates what they're describing. This idea that the old kind of Hollywood movie-making techniques created this kind of desire on the behalf of the spectator. And the spectator was, forced to view women a certain way, and the women didn't really have a lot of power or options. They're just the bearers of the look. They are just there to be looked at, to be desired, saved, or if they're bad, maybe punished. So in the clip that I posted, just notice the way that we are seeing the woman in that scene. You don't need to know anything about the movie or what it's about or whatever. Just watch that scene and notice that we are seeing her very much from the perspective of the male main character or from another male's perspective. But no matter what, no matter how we see her, it's kind of coming from the direction of a male spectator, a man watching her. So that's kind of what they're talking about. So this was a big hit because with movies, this was all very evident and plain to see. So it's not like it's completely gone away, but in the 40, 50 years since a lot of these ideas came out, we do have more women directors. I think we are getting a little better with a diversity of voices in the film industry, but there's no question that the majority of film directors are still white men. So that does limit our perspective to a certain extent, but that is changing, and it's changing largely because some of these feminist ideas that really got applied to the film world. All right, so we'll stop there. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week when we move on to our next unit.